I guess I was what was called a liberal Republican. I believed in balanced budgets. I believed in limited government. I believed in environmental protection. I believed in individual rights as opposed to government. And of course, one of those rights was a woman's right to control her own body. I was a platoon leader. I was wounded twice. I came out of the Korean War with an absolute anger about bombing. And I still think bombing is terror. Those two lessons, fear and the hatred of bombing, I learned firsthand in Korea. And I became obsessed at ending the bombing in Laos and Vietnam and in Cambodia. Suddenly, our congressman died, and we were going to have Shirley Temple. She was the odds-on candidate. We had Reagan as our governor. We had a tap dancer named George Murphy as a senator, and something snapped. I thought, if you're going to gripe about the way the country is run, you ought to be willing to serve in it. So I ran for Congress. When I first ran in 1967, San Mateo County, affluent county south of San Francisco, 2-1 public opinion favored the war. So there was enormous political risk. There was one thing about it, however. The college kids, we registered thousands of Stanford students. I wouldn't have been in politics for more than a year, but for those kids. I'd been elected in December 1967, went home for Christmas, and immediately went to Vietnam. We arrived in Saigon, and we were handed books about how many Viet Cong had surrendered and how many casualties they suffered and why we were winning the war. And in particular, they talked about a big battle the Marines had just won up in Da Nang, where we had killed 200 Viet Cong and lost 30 Marines. So I went up to Da Nang, flew up to Da Nang, and the colonel said, "Oh, yes, we're doing very well up here, sir." And the generals had said we were doing very well down in Saigon. I said, "Well, can I go out and see my old company or talk with a couple of sergeants and lieutenants?" And when I talked with the sergeants and lieutenants, it was an entirely different picture. I'll never forget one lieutenant saying, "Congressman, if they told you we won a big battle up here, we got our ass kicked bad." And I learned that we were being lied to by our whole upper echelon Marine Corps, Army, Air Force, State Department people. They were just essentially lying. They wanted Congress to support the war, so they wanted Congress to think we were winning the war. So it was a shock that the government was lying. That was a shock to learn, because I was a Marine Corps lieutenant colonel. I was gung-ho. And so I came out of it with the feeling that Congress has a particular duty to uncover the untruths of the administration. Americans at that time, 2-1, believed that what we were doing in Vietnam was correct. And they believed because they'd been fed these statistics of body count, of how many enemy killed, and they could accept the idea of Americans being killed because we were fighting against communism. But to learn that the government had lied and that we weren't winning, that started the change in public opinion in 1968. Nixon had to get out of Vietnam because the public demanded it. It was quite clear that a lot of those people that were ready to vote for Nixon on the first ballot didn't like him. He was an unlikable sort of a guy, miserable, mean-spirited, hard to smile, great at shaking hands, but there wasn't much behind him that was friendly. He was not a man that you wanted to love. Nixon has promised if he's made president, he won't enforce the Civil Rights Act of 64 or the Voting Rights Act of 65, which were anathema to the South. That speech by Strom Thurmond, who had left the Democratic Party some years earlier because he thought they were getting soft on black people, that was the start of his Solid South policy, which has now led to where we are today, where the states of the Confederacy are all Republican. And it started with Nixon at that 68 convention. But can you imagine? Here's a man running for the presidency of the United States promising, if you'll nominate me to be president, I won't enforce the law. The president, the first thing he says, he takes an oath to defend the Constitution and to enforce the laws of the United States. That gives you some idea how evil Nixon was. He said he had a plan to end the war. It took us 2 years to learn that that plan was really the secret bombing of Cambodia and Laos and the incredible tonnage of bombs that we dropped in North Vietnam. Nixon believed that no American president could afford to lose a war. I tell you, even now, 20 years later, it's hard for me to understand Nixon's frame of mind. And if he hadn't decided that he had to win the Vietnam War, he might have gone down in history as a great foreign policy president by just breaking through to China, as he did in 1972 after we had fought China in a bitter war 20 years before. A consummate liar. A consummate liar. He was the Machiavelli of the modern age who believed that nations could be manipulated like chess people on a board, and whether you told the truth or not was not necessarily part of it. At the Stanford Law School in 1950, when the Korean War started, my debate partner was John Ehrlichman. John and I stayed friends. And we stayed friends until Nixon was elected. And when John came to the White House as Nixon's number 2 guy, we stayed friends until I made the first speech to impeach Nixon. That speech was on the basis that Nixon, after we had repealed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, suddenly invades Cambodia. And I said, that's unconstitutional. And so that sort of ended John's and my friendship. I was obsessed with ending the war. He was obsessed with defending Nixon. I said, John, you were an honorable lawyer and a great father and a good person. He said, what caused you, John, to do these things? Lie to the grand jury and lie to the Congress? And he looked out across the desert 30 seconds before he answered. He finally said, Pete, it took us 3.5 years to become corrupted by the power of the White House. Corrupted by the power of the White House. I remember a Marine captain, Bobby Muller. Bobby Muller had lost both legs as a Marine in Vietnam. And the kid, they made the movie about Ron Kopix. I was probably the only Republican in the House friendly to them. And so the march and the throwing their medals into the Capitol steps, indicating their anger, that was organized right outside of my office. We'd take them coffee and orange juice, and wonderful guys. We finally cut off the bombing and the funding after the new Congress had been elected in 1972. That was clearly against the war. We passed the War Powers Act. It was a period where the Congress power was in the ascendancy because of the corruption of Nixon and the corruption of the war. Well, lesson number 1 is that the people running the government and the agencies will always lie if necessary. The second lesson that we learned to our peril, I think, is that the secrecy of atomic weapons and the secrecy of war plans has become such that the nation is obsessed with keeping everything secret. The greatest loss to the country has been the loss of Walter Cronkite and Tom Brokaw and Ted Koppel and the people who reported the news. Cy Hirsch, David Halberstam, people that penetrated the lies and fraud and the frippery around politicians to report the truth. Public opinion will sooner or later get at the truth. Lincoln probably said it best. He said, you can fool all of the people some of the time and some of the people all of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time. I'd gotten a call from Gaylord Nelson, a senator from Wisconsin, and his friends told him there's only one Republican in the House of Representatives who can be remotely called an environmentalist, and so that I get the call. What Gaylord Nelson saw was that here were the campuses exploding over the war. Kids that had nothing to do with politics but hated Nixon, hated the war, were going to get drafted when they finished college, or they had brothers and sisters already over in Vietnam. He wanted to take the energy of the anti-war movement and turn it into environmental study. So Earth Day was to be a study session. Well, we then hired the Stanford student body president, Dennis Hayes, to direct the Earth Day, to organize it. And they got the scruffiest kids you ever saw. I guess 100 bearded people just out of Woodstock. And they turned out 20 million people on Earth Day. They took the energy of the anti-war movement and turned it into a practical, wonderful awakening of the environment. And they selected 12 of my colleagues in the House as the Dirty Dozen. Let's defeat these people that are against the environment. And they defeated 7 of the 12 in the election in 1970. So when Congress convened in January 71, suddenly 2/3 of the House and Senate, both parties, I'm now an environmentalist. And if you look what happened the next 10 years, was the great heyday. We passed all the great environmental laws.